A delegation of Canadian legislators recently traveled to China. They raised concerns with officials over there about China's detainment of two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. The delegation is still in Asia, and that's where we have reached Conservative MP and Vice Chair of the Canada-China Legislative Association, Michael Cooper. He joins me very early in the morning by FaceTime from Cambodia. Michael, I want to ask you, the death sentence for Robert Schellenberg was announced during your mission, and I know that even though you are in Cambodia, you are expected to have some conversations with Chinese officials. Have you or has anyone from the Canadian delegation had a chance to speak about the death sentence for Robert Schellenberg with any Chinese officials?
We haven't.
Okay, and so do you plan on discussing that in any future meetings you have, or do you still have meetings with Chinese officials on your agenda?
We don't at this point. The conference that we were at has now concluded, so I'm traveling back to Canada shortly.
Okay, so while you were in China and when you did have those conversations we know that you were pushing Canada's message on the detention of Michael Kovrig and the detention of Michael Spavor. That had happened while you were still in China. We know that you were bringing that message there. And while you were in Cambodia, you did have those meetings. What impression did you get about whether Canada's message was resonating with officials in China?
It's difficult to say. We conveyed the Canadian message. The Chinese officials with whom we met with listened. In some meetings, they did push back in respect of the situation involving Ms. Meng. But nonetheless, it was important, I believe, that we conveyed that message. Now, I think it's important to note that the officials that we did meet with are not directly involved in this issue, nor are we as members of Parliament and senators, in as much as this is a matter that is seized by Global Affairs Canada and our Canadian embassy officials. But nonetheless, the Chinese officials that we did meet with do report up, and from that standpoint, it was important to get the message, the Canadian message, across.
You sort of hinted at it, but what message did the Chinese have for you on this issue when you did bring it up?
Well, they were very much preoccupied with the situation involving Ms. Meng. And in that regard, we highlighted the contrast between the situation involving Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig and how they've been treated versus how Ms. Meng has been treated. Ms. Meng has been afforded routine consular access. She has a lawyer. She is out on bail. And what ultimately happens to Ms. Meng in terms of whether she is extradited will be decided by Canada's independent judiciary, which is completely independent of politics. By contrast, Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig haven't been afforded routine consular access in breach of the agreement that Canada has with China. They don't have a lawyer. It's pretty clear the conditions they're in are unacceptable. And the charges, or so-called charges, that have been laid against them remain unclear at this point. All we have from the Chinese are vague allegations against them. So we contrasted the case of Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor with how Ms. Meng has been treated.
Now that your trip to China is over, when you step back and look at it, did you feel any sort of anti-Canada sentiment while you were on the ground in China?
I didn't, but it's important again to note that we were meeting with officials, we were meeting with academics, business leaders. We didn't have an opportunity to engage people, on the street, so to speak.
And given your experience there, and I know that you wouldn't have traveled to China if you didn't feel safe, and that's a conversation we had before you left. Do you think at this point it's safe for Canadians to go to China, given that we've seen the increased rhetoric from China, given that we've seen the change in sentencing for Robert Schellenberg, and given that these two Canadians are still being held by Chinese authorities? Do you think it's safe for Canadians to go to China?
Well, I would suggest that Canadians travel with a high degree of caution, and in that regard, the travel advisory, a new travel advisory was issued by Global Affairs Canada yesterday, and I would suggest it was probably high time that be done. We've seen instances of Canadians who have been stopped, who have been harassed on administrative issues, so it is a difficult time to travel to China, and anyone who does so, I think, would have to exercise some degree of caution.
So you say it's a difficult time, but overall, would you say Canadians should keep going and go about their business, or should not?
Well, there are many Canadians in China, and many of those Canadians have been here for some time. They're involved in business or a range of other activities. And but nonetheless, I can say that people that we did meet with had some degree of nervousness, and rightfully so, in light of the arbitrary detentions of Canadians that we've seen.
So who were the people that you met with that were nervous?
Well, we met with a number of different Canadians, and I don't want to disclose exactly who we met with and when, but they did indicate some degree of apprehension.
There's one last question I want to ask you about, Michael. You've been at a conference meeting with other legislators from around the world at the Asia-Pacific Parliamentary Forum. Have any other officials from different countries expressed any concern about what China has done in this dispute with Canada?
It hasn't been directly raised at this conference, but there certainly is awareness about this issue. And let me just say that I believe that in terms of where things are at this point, it's not going to be resolved on a consular basis. This is a political matter, and given the seriousness of it, especially in light of what has happened with Mr. Schellenberg, it is time for the Prime Minister to directly engage with the President of China. The time has come. It's frankly been far too long. It's time for the Prime Minister to step up.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and safe travels back to Canada.
Thanks, Katie.